Good morning, good evening, guys, whichever the time zone you're in. Welcome to Scrum webcast, powered by Scrum Studio, co-powered by Scrum Master Studio, Agile Leadership Studio, and Product Owner Studio. And behind this studio, there are a lot of minds that is working on to make sure this is well organized, including Arun Vignesh, Kiran, and Venkatrao. So I just have to mention their names. I'm sorry, Umar as well. They've been doing a wonderful job. And the vision of this webcast is basically to humanize organizations, and that we think Scrum is more a mindset than a framework. So today we have our one and only Steve Porter. Before I give more introduction about him, I'm going to talk about the tech setup. Then I'll come back to Steve's introduction. So guys, you'll be muted throughout this webcast to just ensure that we don't have a background noise, but there is a Q&A window where you can start posting your questions. It's going to be an open conversations, and we should be able to unmute you if you have a follow-up question. And just in the spirit of making sure that the webcast is not distracted, I'm going to be the facilitator to make sure that I'm going to moderate the overall discussions. I hope people that are returning to our webcast over and over again, you know the procedure. If you have any questions, please feel free to post to me privately on the chat. I should be able to respond. Little bit about Scrum. We are a mission or a vision based organization, whatever you want to call. So our mission is to humanize organizations by helping them become fully capable and resilient. So we are a partner of a number of organizations. For more information, please visit tryscrum.com. And coming to our studios, I think I have to mention this due to the lot of brains that is working in making this community up and running and fueling. We have been nominated as one of the World Agility Forum nominee for the best community company in 2020. We hope we get the nominations in 2021 because our contributions to the community is continuing. For more information, please visit tryscrum.com/studios. You'll be able to see the community contributions, and there are a lot of recordings available on the Scrum website. I would encourage you to visit them from some thought leaders. And I'm a bit nervous and excited to introduce Steve Porter for one reason. I think he is very close to my heart. It's not an inflated words, but 4 years before the same month, I was in Bengaluru attending my first Train the Trainer with Steve Porter. I know, Steve, that you were actually having a lot of conversations with me in the late evening, especially on the third day, talking about the Scrum Mastery, the path towards becoming a PhD and all that. I don't know if you remember the dates and the month, but this is the month exactly 4 years before we met first time.
Excellent.
So,
I really do miss my time in India. I'm going to blame. I can blame some of it on COVID, obviously not being able to travel, but some of it before that, just not being able to get back. I love the energy I get when I'm there, talking to practitioners, meeting with people who are really passionate about your mission, humanizing, self-management, helping people get better. It's just very energizing being in India, and I do really miss it. And thank you very much for inviting me to this, to spend a little bit of time. I can feel like I'm in India, even though I'm not actually there.
you're most welcome, Steve. It's our pleasure, I would say. And he is one of the, I would say, a long-standing person behind some of the ideas in the Scrum and the Agile community. He is a member of Scrum.org. He is a co-author of Kanban and the Nexus guide. Next time when you read the Kanban or the Nexus guide from Scrum.org resources, please make sure you remind there are a lot of work this gentleman done in the guides. And I've personally learned a lot of stuff with Steve. It's not just 1 or 2 days interactions. I've been interacting with him for more than 4 years. And he is my mentor, a good colleague, and I would say even a good friend. And thank you so much, Steve, for accepting this invite and spending your time with us today.
Oh, thank you very much. Like I said, happy to have a conversation with you and the people on the call. Really looking to hear about what their questions are, and who knows, I might even have a good answer or two.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We have a lot of people that joined, and we are going to start getting the questions from them. And before I go and take some questions from the participant, I think I should ask you this, Steve. I think you have been in the community and you have been using Scrum for years. And I should ask you this question: who else? What is the state of Scrum that you think today?
The state of Scrum today, it's generally healthy, but it is in a bit of flux right now. And anytime things are in flux, things are changing. There's lots of opportunities there. One of the things that I'm really excited about is a little bit about my background. I have an IT background. Started as a developer, and that was decades ago, and well before Scrum and Agile was available, and it was a tough role to be in. It was a very tough position to be in, being in IT before the Agile movement and Scrum happened. It wasn't a very fun place to be. And one of the things that I really liked about Scrum was that it made my work environment better. Again, your mission is to humanize the workplace, and I think Scrum has a very strong role in empowering people and allowing them to deliver value. As a developer, nothing made me more happy than working on something, giving it to a customer, and having that customer's life get better because of it. And generally, IT has done a really good job of embracing this agile mindset, embracing the framework, empowering people. These ideas, they brought it into business to help IT be better. Unfortunately, now that that's happened, IT used to be the part that was slowing down the company. And IT's gotten better to the point where other parts of the business now are becoming the bottleneck. And what's been gratifying for me is to see people who don't have an IT background looking at what IT is doing, looking at agility and looking at Scrum and saying, hey, is there something here that can help us? And I think we have a whole new audience of people that we can take this to. Unfortunately, with that new audience, a lot of the struggle that we had bringing these ideas to IT, that I think we were generally successful because they're good ideas, we're now having that struggle over again because we're having to explain it to a whole new audience. And I don't know if that's been your experience as you're talking to more people about Scrum, as it's people outside of IT that we're talking to, because they're seeing the potential for benefit, but it's more work for us.
Yep.
I don't know if that matches your experience as well.
Yeah, of course. I think there are a lot of synergies that I see in your explanation, even though we represent different set of cultures. Scrum is Scrum. I also get a different perspective from you, Steve. I think on the other day I was talking to Dave West, and this is the information I got. He's a data-driven, a great human being. And he said, we are going to cross 1 billion people when it comes to intelligent worker. McKinsey predicted that we are going to cross 1 billion intelligent workers sooner. So there are a lot of people who might need help in doing their, making their life better, as you rightly said. So coming to the relevant question that is coming from this conversation, Steve, more than 15 million or so people use Scrum. And we also talked about, Scrum is very much proven successful in many, many organizations. At the same time, we have a lot of work to do because a lot of organizations struggling to use Scrum.
Yeah.
So a couple of tips from you that the organizations that are trying to start Scrum, maybe a couple of tips or a couple of advices from you.
Wow. Approach any new change with humility, and acknowledge that while you're trying to implement something new, you're going to make mistakes along the way. And that is okay. That's how we learn. So for the companies that are looking at making these changes and potentially getting some value from it, don't be afraid to start. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. the trick to making this work is to keep your mistakes as small as possible and then correct them and move forward. It's one of the things that I love about Scrum is it mandates relatively small time boxes. And we do that to minimize the risk. So for organizations that are getting started, the tip that I want them to take is be ready to make mistakes, but make them small and then make corrections and make improvements.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very nice way of summarizing, Steve. So I'm just going to go with the participants. They have some questions. There are a lot of people waiting in the queue, so I'm trying to approve them and take questions one by one. I'm going to look at my mobile as well, Steve, so that I can manage the questions better.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, the first question I have, before that, participants, those who are on the call, you can use the Q&A window to post your questions. So I'm going to make sure that I can accommodate as many questions as possible, but with the constraint that we have as a time box. So I would also be monitoring your questions to make sure if I can relate your questions into maybe, aggregate your questions into one or two questions. I would also be doing that. The first question we have, Steve, is we have been hearing a lot of differences between Scrum Master and Agile Coach, right? So they wanted to basically understand what is your opinion on the difference between the Scrum Master and Agile Coach, if there is any difference.
Yeah. When I look at what makes a really good Scrum Master and when I look at what makes a really good Agile Coach, I see those being exactly the same thing. Now, how it's implemented in an organization is obviously very different. Titles for people are very important. So using the right title to help that person be successful is something I can understand. So in an organization, having an Agile Coach and a Scrum Master mean different things because that's going to help the organization. Then you do what you need to do to be successful in your organization. But for me, what do they do, what they need to do to be successful is exactly the same. Now, you may find an Agile Coach who isn't as steeped in Scrum theory as you may find with a Scrum Master, though I have to admit these days, if I was talking to someone who called himself an Agile Coach and didn't have a very good solid understanding of Scrum, I don't think I would find that, or I would find that unusual. The other things that often get attached to Agile Coaches is understanding of lean, understanding of process, people skills, facilitation skills, organizational skills. All of those things that people will ascribe to an Agile Coach are things that Scrum Masters should have, good Scrum Masters should have. They may not have them. Not every Scrum Master is going to be excellent, but it is something that they should have.
Excellent.
Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Yeah, it does, Steve. It does. And it's a different perspective. I've asked this question over and over again to a lot of thought leaders as part of a webcast. And this perspective, as usual, is completely unique and different.
Right. And I do appreciate that some organizations look at Scrum Masters and Agile Coaches differently. And if that helps the organization, then I'm not going to say you're doing something wrong. But the things that you look for in an Agile Coach, you should also look for in your Scrum Masters.
Okay. So the next interesting question that I have is related to scaling. Yes. So is scaling a myth or fact?
Organizations need help with working on very large things. So if that's what you think of when you think about scaling, then I think it's a fact. When you've got a small thing, the patterns and practices that you use to be successful are different than when you're working with lots and lots of people on very large products.
Okay, great. So I have a follow-up question. I'm not sure if that is relevant, but let me take this question at this point of time. So, what are your thoughts on SAFE and how it uses Kanban across its different levels? Is it enough? Should we be doing something different?
So I hope you're okay if I tell a little story because I've got a as some of your audience members might be aware, when SAFe was first released, one of the co-creators of Scrum, Ken Schwaber, released a blog post with a very strong opinion about SAFe, and he didn't like what he saw. These were very early days, and Ken had a very strong opinion of what was being published and what people were hearing. I joined Scrum.org after that post, and when we started hearing from our customers that they know about SAFe, but they're looking to Scrum.org and looking to Ken to say, what we've got these large organizations, Scrum doesn't seem to help with that. What can we do? So as part of us as a group trying to help organizations deal with these larger scale endeavors, I did some research. I did a whole bunch of reading I went and read about Spotify and what they're doing. I went and dug into some of what Bass and Craig are doing with less. And one of the additional things I wanted to learn about was SAFe. So the best way to learn about SAFe is to go take a class. So I hopped on a plane and I flew to Denver, Boulder, Colorado in the US, and took a 5-day SAFe class with Dean Leffingwell, the person who created it. And as with any classes, you've been aware of this, one of the things they often do is they go around everybody in the class and have them introduce themselves. So Dean was going around talking to everybody, and he came to me and said, and I introduced myself, hi, I'm Steve Porter, I'm from Scrum.org. And Dean stopped and went, does Ken know you're here? And I'm like, yes, Ken knows I'm here. Ken paid for me to be here because he wants to learn about this. And I did. I learned a lot of really great things about SAFe, and a lot of things that I learned were awesome. They talked about Scrum, which I obviously think is good. Some of the ways they talked about Scrum was ways that I don't talk about Scrum, and I had some really great conversations with the people who create the material, and we went back and forth on that, and that was great. And overall, I came out of that 5-day class with a lot of knowledge, some really interesting ideas. So when you ask me what are my thoughts on SAFe, it's a great collection of really interesting ideas that I know a lot of companies have embraced and have used to get better, and introduced Scrum in a lot of organizations that might have been a little leery about introducing this framework to let their teams self-manage. For large organizations, self-manage can be a little scary, but SAFe made it easier for them to adopt these things. So I've got to be careful about the wording here, because there is things about SAFe that I don't find that great, that I worry it is a little bit heavy, and it asks people to make a lot of choices about what not to include, because there are lots of things there that they don't need, and that can be difficult. But generally, if people get value from it, great. And I've worked with companies that are doing SAFe, and I've helped them squeeze some extra value out of it. So that's really good. So general thoughts on SAFe. Now, how it uses Kanban across the different levels, I think is brilliant. One of the things that one of the many things that Scrum doesn't talk about, and that's the thing with being a framework, is we really have this fairly small set of rules that we give to people and say, hey, give it a try. So there's lots of things we don't talk about. One of the things that we don't talk about is how to manage a portfolio. When you're a big organization and you've got multiple products and multiple Scrum teams, how do you manage that work? And I really like Kanban as a strategy to help organizations manage the flow of value. So I think the general idea is brilliant. Now, how it's talked about specifically inside of SAFe, are there ways it can be improved? Yes, absolutely. But generally, if you're a large organization, using the Kanban strategy to minimize your work in progress, to make sure you actively manage the flow of the work that you're doing, to visualize as much as possible, those principles are awesome. Hope that helps with that, whoever asked that question. It was
Yeah, I
David
think.
Rodriguez.
Yeah, I hope it answered your question, David. It was a very good story, Steve. We got to know this story. Ken sending you to the safe class. It is really, really, you know, a
Yeah.
delight to hear these kind of stories directly from you.
Yeah, it was a good class, and I always encourage people to take opportunities to learn from people. And the live training, spending 1 or more days with people who have been in the trenches and are practitioners is a great way to learn. And I learned a lot in those 5 days.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so I have another question. It is interestingly from the Scrum Guide. So, what do we mean by rules in the Scrum Guide?
One of the things I like about the way that the Scrum Guide is put together, and one of the ways we do talk about it, is we do talk about the Scrum Guide as a bit of a rule book. It's here's the things that define whether you're doing Scrum or not. When I think of the rule book, I'll talk about baseball. The rule book of baseball just describes the different activities that you do, and it helps describe what is baseball and what isn't baseball. And there are things that may look like baseball, but because the rules are different, they're not. My favorite example, one of my very first trips to India, on my birthday of all things, one of our colleagues took me to dinner for my birthday, and it happened to be the time when there was a very important cricket match going on. It might have been India and Pakistan playing, and I don't know cricket at all. So we sat down, had dinner, and watched the match going on, and my colleague explained the rules to me. And as I was watching it, it was initially all very confusing. As a North American watching cricket for the first time, it's like, well, there's a bat, and what's that wicket for, and I don't understand all these things. And he explained the rules to me. There's so many people on the team. They do these things. This is how they score points. All of these rules were important for defining what cricket was. And I think one of the things I like about the Scrum Guide is it helps define what is Scrum and also what isn't Scrum. So when I was watching cricket, in my head, I was making analogies back to baseball because baseball's got a bat and it's got a ball and it's got some similar things. So I was able to make some connections to it. But some of the rules of baseball aren't the rules of cricket. And yes, they're both still sports. Yes, you still have men running around doing stuff, but they are different games. So when I think of the rules of Scrum, it helps define what you're doing and helps define what isn't this thing, and hopefully allows everybody to do the same thing at the same time. Can you imagine the mess that you would have if you had people on your cricket team who wanted to play baseball? And they brought different equipment and they start putting bases out. It would be a mess. So by having a clear set of rules, it allows people to come together to do an activity, and they can all be doing the same activity. I hope that helps. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to remember that great memory I had of watching. And by the way, India won. It was a really great night that I had in Bangalore that time.
Thanks, Steve. I think next time you should come to Chennai. Okay, so
I will.
we will have
Absolutely, I
that.
will.
I will have that private conversations offline, but I'll go back to the questions that we have in the queue. Pretty long queue, but I will try to manage. So people that are waiting to ask questions, please post your questions on the Q&A panel that you see. And that's when we know that you have a question to ask. If you have any follow-up question, please feel free to put. I will try to make sure that we take as many questions as possible. Okay, a question on a product goal. So there is no much explanation on the product goal in the Scrum Guide. So what's your take on that? How long a product goal should be?
Product goal has been an interesting thing for me as a Scrum practitioner. The Scrum Guide has been updated think about 6 or 7 times. I'd have to go back and look at my kind of a running history of the different changes. And the product goal for me was one of the first times where something new was put in the Scrum Guide. In a lot of cases, as we made revisions, we were pulling stuff out to make it simpler. But it was one of the few times where we put something new in, and it was brand new, and it was fairly significant. So when I saw it there, I'm like, whoa, this is interesting. Like I don't have any experience with product goals because it's new. It wasn't in early versions of Scrum Guide. It's only in the new one. But then I kind of stopped and thought back. It's like, well, hang on a second. Just because it wasn't in the Scrum Guide doesn't mean I wasn't necessarily doing it already. And it made me think back to the good Scrum teams that I was working on. And we would often have product roadmaps that we would look at that would define more than just what we're doing in the next sprint. It would often look forward a handful of sprints, 4, 5, 6 sprints. The companies that I work with, they often do quarterly roadmaps. So that would be 3 months worth of work, which could be, 3 sprints, could be more. And when I looked back at those experiences I had before they put the product goal into the Scrum Guide, I'm like, we kind of did have a product goal. We didn't call it a product goal, but it was just, here's the big thing that is really important for us for the next release that we're doing. So when you're looking at how big they should be, it's hard to give guidance. If you're able to complete them in a sprint, that feels like it might be a bit too small because we already have a sprint goal for that. But if you've decided that for whatever reason that your product goal is only going to last you a sprint because that's the most important thing we want to work on and our entire product backlog is going to be focused on that, I'm not going to tell you you're doing anything wrong, but it does feel a little bit odd to me. If you've got a product goal that is hard to focus on because it's so large and is going to take so many sprints, then I wonder if you've lost the value of having a product goal at all. Having something that your stakeholders and your Scrum team can focus on from sprint to sprint to sprint to see if they're making progress on it, that's the whole purpose of that product goal. So if it gets to be too big, it ends up taking too much time and it's not allowing you to focus and it's not allowing you to have a product backlog that is focused on getting that done, then you might consider maybe it's too big. For me, whenever I get these questions, is it too big or is it too small? It's always fall back on what's the purpose, right? So the purpose is to give you something that's not a sprint goal to help your teams focus on delivering value. That's a horrible trainer answer because it was basically a very long it depends, but hopefully I can encourage people again to think back for the reason we have a product goal and then make the amount of time it takes to achieve that fit the purpose.
Yeah, I hope it helps somebody who had asked this question. I couldn't see your name. It was a pretty long answer, but yeah, it deserves that. So the next question, Steve, may be a controversial question. Feel free to skip. Feel free to skip that question. But I just wanted to personally hear your thoughts on that as well,
Sure.
right? So on a scaling topic, Nexus versus safe versus less, there is a leadership engagement problem towards achieving the business agility, right? So what are your recommendations and experience with these three, especially the Nexus over safe over less?
Right. Those, and you've mentioned 3, but there are more than those 3. If you do a little bit of searching on scaling approaches or scaling frameworks, other ones will come into play. And I'm glad that you separated out those different topics, those different frameworks from this idea of leadership engagement, cultural transformation, entire organizations, and business agility. Because I think by disconnecting those frameworks, those approaches, from the larger topics around business agility and potentially cultural transformation, I think putting the focus there, which is probably a more important place to put the focus, is better than putting your focus on the framework or the tools to help you get there. Venkatesh, you and I are both PSTs. We often know that tooling does have a role, but it shouldn't be the most important thing you should be looking at. The tool should fit the purpose.
Yep.
So if the purpose and your discussions with leadership, your discussions around the entire organization, the idea of transformation should be around what's the purpose we're trying to achieve here? Because if you haven't got the purpose down first, if you haven't got that clear understanding of here's what we're trying to achieve, the why behind business agility, the why behind cultural transformation, if you don't have that really clear, then it probably doesn't matter what tool you pick, whether it be SAFe or Nexus or less. So start there. And then I'm a big fan of potentially experimenting with a few different tools. Because you may find that some parts of your organization, something really lightweight like Nexus, and that's one of the things that I do like about Nexus, it is incredibly lightweight, much like Scrum, but something lightweight like Nexus might be the perfect fit for that part of the organization based on what you're trying to achieve. There might be parts of your organizations where the more prescriptive nature of SAFe might be important for you. The additional guardrails, the additional guidance might be great. There might be a product, a very large product, that you will really benefit from having less's hyper focus on organizational change and having a very strong view on system thinking, which I think less really brings into play. So, for this question, start with the organization, start with the business leaders, start with getting them to talk about why and their purpose. And then try lots of different tools to see which one fits best for solving that ultimate purpose that you're trying to get.
So I didn't cover the last part of the question. Actually, that part is the controversial question. Which one do you recommend among this?
And I'm not, I can't recommend one thing because there's no one answer. What I will say though is each one of these different toolings has their strength and their weaknesses. Nexus is really lightweight, which is a definite strength, but it's not very prescriptive. So if you're looking for additional guidance, you're going to have to find it elsewhere from Nexus. SAFe is incredibly prescriptive. And what I mean by that is it gives you lots of guidance. It doesn't say you have to do all of it, but it does give you lots of guidance. You run the risk then of picking the wrong guidance or disempowering your teams because you're not using bottom-up intelligence, you're using what's in SAFe. So you have to make that trade-off. And again, less really does have this focus on looking at organizational change and requires a lot of organization, is focused on one product. So that might be the right tool based on your need.
Wow.
I will say when in doubt, when you're not quite sure what circumstance you're in, I will often encourage people to use the cheapest, lightest method because that will help you learn the most. And in that way, I will say Nexus is probably the easiest to get started with because it doesn't require a lot of upfront investment. Yep. So when in doubt, start with what's easiest, but then be really rigorous on taking the learnings that you get and then rolling them back in. And you might find, you may start with Nexus, and you might find that you end up moving to something a little bit more prescriptive and organizational bound like SAFe or less.
Well, that's a very nice perspective, Steve. I should definitely give that acknowledgement because context is everything. You talked about that. And
absolutely.
Yes, and you also talked about make your mistakes a little less expensive. Right.
Yeah. I really hope your listeners, the people on the call, really embrace this idea of we're doing things that are new, right? Every day is a new day. And for the work that we're doing, because we're not in factories anymore, because this is knowledge work, the value that we produce comes from doing something that we've never done before. And because we're in that environment, we're going to make mistakes. The trick is to keep the impact of that mistake as small as possible and to maximize the learning you get from the mistakes. That's really critical. And that's the one thing I like about Scrum. I like a lot about these fairly lightweight approaches is they do try to maximize the learning potential and the value you get from learning.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for
You're
the
welcome.
wonderful explanation. I have another question which is interesting. Product backlog is transparent, visible, and understood from the Scrum guide. The lines are taken from the Scrum guide.
Yeah.
And what is the difference between transparent, visible, and understood?
Oh, interesting. The first easy one is visible. You can have things that I can see, but I may not understand them. And if I can't understand them, then there is certainly a lack of transparency there. So for me, visible is it's a nice start, but it may not be enough. Visible is a good first step to helping you get to transparent and understood. If you're looking for the differences, I think there's probably a closer correlation between transparent and understood. I think those words I could probably interchange very easily. But visible just on its own, I want to encourage people to think about is making things visible enough? Because there are cases where it won't be.
I hope that
Bit of a short-
answers, yeah, I hope that answers your question, Lars. The more transparent are we, the more understanding that we're gonna gain, not just with the visibility, because the visibility may be a little volatile as well.
Yeah, and actually, when I think about the language that we use in Scrum and talk about things being transparent, which is obviously an important part of empiricism and the scientific method, I wonder if it might be more useful to talk about understood with people, because transparent, at least in the English language, transparent has multiple meanings, whereas understood might be a word that might be easier to understand for people when we're looking at what the goal is. You really want your product backlog to be understandable.
Thank you, Steve. So the relevant question I have is again an interesting question. So we talked about transparency, visibility, and all that. Is there any difference between openness and transparent?
Again, I do think there is some nice correlation between the two, right? It is hard to have a transparent environment if you're not open. So I'm not sure I see a huge difference with that. Maybe the additional piece you might add to it, and again, it is around that understood term, is openness that isn't shared widely. So you and I can be open with each other. If I'm on a Scrum team and we can be open with each other, that may not necessarily lead to better understanding in the team as a whole. It may not lead to transparency with our stakeholders. So openness just on its own may not be enough to reach that area of clear understanding that you're looking for to make sure that you have this opportunity to have a learning environment where everybody involved can get better over a period of time.
Thank you. I'm going to steal this response in my classes with your comment.
Yeah, I want to apologize to your listeners as a native English speaker. I feel I need to apologize for the obtuseness of the English language, because there are so many different words that you can use that in a lot of cases mean the same thing. And there are times where there are small nuances that as a person whose English is my first language, I understand. But now that Scrum is being used across the entire planet, and like I'm trying to think off the top of my head how many different languages the Scrum Guide has been translated into. And this common language that we've had in writing the Scrum Guide, this English language, is now being stretched and it's being pulled. And it's one of the challenges that we are facing with. We talked earlier about the state of Scrum. There are so many different people with so many different languages and cultures using it right now, and that's a challenge. So hopefully we will, and I know, and I can guarantee this, that Ken and Jeff have learned a lot over the decades of trying to teach people about Scrum and get value from Scrum. They've learned the power of the different words that they've used, and they have made adjustments over time.
Yeah, I think that is also an evidence why we are getting a lot of questions related to the Scrum Guide from this region, because we are not native English speakers. And personally, I learned English a lot after starting using Scrum, especially started reading Scrum, because there are a lot of interpretations one might make, and we got to make sure that the consistency of that language is there.
It is. And the nice thing with the Scrum Guide and with its translations is it does try to be that one rule book that everybody can come to and everybody can agree upon. And hopefully your listeners can appreciate that can be difficult when you do have different languages being represented. And then to take it to even another step, with different cultures being represented, because we certainly, I deal with this as, for your listeners, I'm Canadian, so the co-creators of the Scrum Guide are American, and a lot of people may think it's like, well, you're basically the same, you both speak English, but the cultural differences between Ken and Jeff and myself, there are definite cultural differences there, and those do come out when we're talking about Scrum and some of the words they use. They also come out in Scrum teams. And I would imagine that India, because you have become this hub of IT development where lots of different languages and countries and cultures are interacting with you, this must be something that you and your listeners are dealing with on a daily basis, trying to navigate these differences in languages and these differences in cultures. And hopefully having that clear Scrum Guide helps, in a small way, give you a common base to work on.
Thanks, Steve. So there is one interesting question with regards to the stakeholders. How to onboard a tough stakeholder or a sponsor to Scrum?
The context is going to be really important here. So any answer I give you, please take with a grain of salt, because your context is going to be different than my context. In my context, it's really helpful when you're onboarding new sponsors to have them be able to talk about their vision, their desires, their goals. It's like, what are you hoping to achieve here? Back to that why that I talked about earlier with larger organizations. What are your aspirations? What do you want to get out of the work that we're doing together? And reinforce that we're doing this together. That you are a part of this group of people who are trying to produce some value for the organization that you're working on. So bring them in, introduce them, allow them to talk about what their vision is, what their value, what they're looking for, and then start looking on building some common language, right? So that the words that the people doing the work are talking about, so they might be talking about product backlog items and sprints, and they might have their own technical language that they use. Try to introduce those words to the new sponsor so that you can have a common language, and they're going to have language that they use. So the team should hear that and take every opportunity to use the language of the sponsor and the stakeholder to build that common bond. That's a good way to start. But again, your mileage may vary. So please look for opportunities to find your own ways of bringing them on board. And if you do find a really great way of bringing a sponsor on board that had nothing to do with what I just said, I would love to hear about it, and I'd love for you to share it so that other people can learn.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for that humility. I think context is everything, as Steve rightly said. There is no methodology in onboarding a stakeholder, so you inspect and adapt.
Yeah.
Um, I'm getting a lot of questions, but I'm trying to pick a question that is in the order that we received.
Right.
Um, so that's an interesting question. In your experience, Steve, as an I don't understand this sentence. Okay, the essential role in the Scrum framework, in your opinion, or maybe in my humble opinion, is the Scrum Master can be a part-time role. That's the assumption of the candidate. And what about the PO role?
So it's always an interesting discussion around the various levels of importance of the different accountabilities in Scrum and which one is more important than the other. And it's an interesting discussion, but I always remind people at the end of the day that they're all important, that they all need to be there. So I'm not going to get too into that part of the discussion now. That being said, the concept of having someone who is not fully focused on their accountability, and that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a Scrum Master who's their full focus isn't on that Scrum Master accountability, or a product owner where their full focus isn't on that accountability as a PO. And I do know that it is tough to be accountable for something if it's not your primary focus. And you're going to struggle. Now, people will do the best that they can do given the context that they have. So if the context you're in doesn't allow you to fully focus on your accountability, and that can happen as a Scrum Master, that can happen as a product owner, and we should add that happens as a developer too. You might only be part-time on a team, and that's really going to hinder your ability to be accountable. The only thing I will suggest is if you're not going to be 100% focused on something, acknowledge the risk. Acknowledge that it's not optimal. And on a fairly regular cadence, look to see what the impact of that lack of focus is having on the value that as an entire group you're delivering. And you may be a product owner that even though you are not 100% focused on the Scrum team that you're the product owner for, you may still be able to have a fairly high level of outcomes and provide a ton of value. But if you don't acknowledge that this isn't optimal and you don't continuously come back and look at, is this the best thing? How are we doing at this? Could I be doing a better job? Maybe it would be better if I did focus on this entirely. What's the loss that we're having because I'm not fully focused on this? If you don't continually do that, then you run the risk of having suboptimal outcomes and not understanding why you're having them. So again, a relatively long-winded answer, but with these questions that are really more it depends-y, it really comes back down to those basics of acknowledge the issue and continuously look for ways to improve the situation you're in.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And so, Swapna, I don't understand your question well. What's the best way to go about creating LACE within an organization? So I don't understand what does it mean, LACE. If you can expand that, I can put that question as the next question to Steve.
Yeah, that would be good. I'm curious what that acronym is for.
Yeah, I'm also, but I'm not sure about it. I would request her to put, while she puts that, we'll go with the next question.
Yeah.
There is a situational question, Steve. Suppose a Scrum team goes from healthy conflict to unhealthy conflict. Of course, as a Scrum Master, I have a role to play, but I've done all I could and things don't get better. At what moment do I involve management? Would that be a personal failure for me? Can you elaborate more on this?
Yeah, I do like this question. The the key pieces for me here is acknowledging they have a role to play. So as a Scrum Master, helping the team navigate conflict is part of my role. That's part of my accountability. So good that you acknowledge that. It also seems from this question is that they've tried. They acknowledge that this is part of what I've done, and I have tried. However, the conflict has escalated. And then what to do next? Bringing in outside help is never a bad thing, and I'm hoping people don't consider that a failure. Identifying where you need help isn't a failure. That's actually a sign of being a professional. So going to look for outside help, and often the wider organization, if they've got structures in place to help with this, whether that be HR or whether they're able to bring in additional coaching or whether you're maybe able to bring in another Scrum Master, those are all perfectly valid responses to this, and it's not a failure. A failure would be doing nothing. That's what the failure would be. Trying to make things better and acknowledging that I've tried everything I can do when I need help is not a failure. So hopefully that is a little bit of advice you can take back to your organization, and advice. There's lots of advice you can get. There's YouTube videos. There's maybe you can attend a course on conflict management. There are other things you can do, but I like that you have acknowledged that this is something that I need to work on, and if I can't solve it myself, I'll get help elsewhere.
Okay, so I think in the spirit of time, Steve, I'm going to end the question and answer from the participants. And one personal question that I have, I think many people have asked me this in my different conversations, webcasters and all. I thought I can ask this question to you as well.
Sure.
Are there any workshops coming up for PSM3 or PSPO3?
So workshops for the assessments?
Workshops for the assessments, like how we have workshops for PSM2.
Oh, haha. So products, so classes.
Yeah.
That's a good question. My like any organization right now, we are always looking at opportunities to provide more value for people, and the interest in having another level of classes above our level 2 classes. And I have to be very careful because I when I say level 2 classes, one of the things that we've discovered, because we have a PSM2 class and we have a PSPO-A class, and the A stands for advanced. And one of the things that we're looking at is maybe there's something around having more classes that are more along the lines of a -A. And what I mean by that is instead of just having another level of class, having a class that goes off and talks about another topic in depth. Venkatesh, you're aware, and I'll let your audience be aware, we just recently released a course on evidence-based management. It's in our leadership track, so it's PEL-EBM. You'll notice that we didn't have a PEL-2 class, right? We just decided to kind of invest in this particular topic of EBM. And that's something we've just released. Our class before that was the PSPOA class. So certainly the direction we've been going in the past is having these classes that are more focused on a topic, not focused on a level. That's what we've done in the past. I can't tell you what we're going to do in the future because I'm not good at predicting the future. But I will point out to your listeners that instead of having another level class, we've been looking more directly at topics. Now, that being said, I would love to hear from the listeners what topics they're interested in. So instead of thinking about it just being a level 3 class, what topics are they interested in? Because for me, when someone attends a class, I'm hoping they're there to learn about something, not I'm here because it's the next level. And I'd love to hear from your listeners. What topics would they like to learn more about? And then maybe we could build some learning around that. Until we do that, you're just going to have to engage with our PST community. So Venkatesh and work with him to get the learnings that might eventually end up in another class.
Thank you, Steve. So keep your questions coming. If you have anything, you can write to help@tryscrum.com. We will pass on those questions and feedback to, as how we do, we write to support@scrum.org. So they take all this information and pass on to the right people. Yeah. That's all I had, Steve, today. Unfortunately, we could not accommodate all the questions, people. It's not intentional. It's just because of the constraint we have with the time box. Right. I hope you don't mind, and this is not a only opportunity to ask questions. You can add Steve on LinkedIn. You can add us on LinkedIn. We should be able to provide some of our thoughts as well for some of the questions that you asked. Steve, thank you very much. I can't thank you enough, but thank you so much for spending valuable 1 hour with us, answering some of the questions on Scrum, Agile, and various topics very professionally without any hesitations. And we look forward to hosting you once again. You had something to say for us?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that the conversations you're having around Scrum and business agility and scaling and these sort of pieces, please make sure you continue having these conversations. I'm not the smartest person in the room. You can every time I teach a class, I learn something just from having conversations with people. So have these conversations with people, and I'm glad you were able to have a bit of a conversation with me, answering questions. But talk amongst yourself, talk with Venkatesh, talk with other practitioners. It's in that talking that the learning happens. So continue to keep learning, because that's the only thing that's going to make you better.
Thank you so much, Steve. And we had a lot of insights, and we learned a few things. Definitely a fresh and new perspective from you today. And I hope you stay safe, and I look forward to hosting you once again. Thank you so much for your time, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. And everybody have a great day and have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.